All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to part three of the Digital Equity in Times of Crisis webinar hosted by ISTE's Digital Equity PLN. Today, I'm so excited. We have a wonderful group of panelists tonight, and we're going to focus on teacher education and ed leadership. If you are live tweeting, we would like to remind you to tag at Dig Equity PLN and also use the hashtag ISTDEPLN so we can keep that conversation going and keep those questions popping in. And if there's something that we share that you want to share out to your social media, please do. If you are joining us live and you are in our chat, please make sure you pull down that chat drop down option so it shows all panelists and attendees so that we can get all of your questions and your comments and we can actually have a really engaging conversation. We have Miss Sarah Thomas in the chat moderating for us. Shout out to Sarah. And so I am also one of your moderators tonight. I am Patricia Brown. Also joining me in moderating this webinar is the Dr. Nicole Howard.
Hi, everybody. So good to be here. And as Patricia already mentioned, we have Sarah Thomas moderating our webinar chat. We also have Matt Highfield supporting in our webinar chat and also on Twitter. We are very excited to have with us Bettina Shea today, Rosa Isaiah, Valerie Lewis, Sharice Martinez McBride, and Rachelle Dene Poth. We are really looking forward to diving into this conversation. And so usually, you do a heavy introduction of your panelists, and today we want them to share a bit about themselves with you as they each answer the questions that we have for them today. So we'll dive in and begin with our first question. We plan to focus this webinar on how we're specifically addressing digital equity in light of COVID-19. We still need to think about that. We know that, and we still need to think about how we reimagine education, but we also want to center how we do it in a way that addresses what we're facing, what we've been facing, but what we're seeing right now, which is anti-Black racism in our educational institutions, in our world, in our organizations. So we would like to know, what is your perspective about how we should address anti-Black racism? And we want to hear from you on how you might be also addressing digital equity under that umbrella within your context. Is there anyone ready to dive into that first layered question?
I know
it's a big
in.
Okay.
It's a big one. It's a big one. Gosh, it's been such a challenging week. I think maybe that word doesn't even do it justice. It has been exhausting. In addressing the question, in my role as an ed leader, we have to follow through with plans. And so I was thinking about this recently, about what does it mean to begin this anti-racist work in support of all of our students, specifically our African American, Black and Brown students. And three things came to mind. So acknowledge, declare, and invest. And the acknowledge piece is acknowledging that this is an issue, first of all. I was watching TV and I heard someone say, well, systemic racism doesn't exist. And so part of coming to terms with that is, as a district, as a school, understanding and declaring, acknowledging that this is a problem. The declaring piece is more solidarity. So acknowledging that we have a role in creating change. But along with that is the follow through. And so following through with investing not only in programs, materials, devices, PD training, but the right people to be able to carry out that work. And so as a district, as a school, putting out a statement about solidarity is wonderful and beautiful, but the follow through that comes with that and the educating of every person that is working with kids is a really important piece.
I'm happy to follow up with that. Thank you, Rosa. I think that's really foundational, and it relates to what some of the things I've been thinking about. My name is Sharice McBride, and I am a literacy researcher and a teacher educator at University of California, Berkeley. And I am excited about the times that we're in, even though my heart has been really heavy and broken. It feels like we're at a tipping point. And the way I think about it is that anti-Blackness is and really has been a part of our country's history. It's really what our country is founded on. I think about what Toni Morrison has said, that she talks about it as part of the foundation of like the quintessential American identity. I was looking back over her book, the Playing in the Dark, and she talks about the construction of Blackness and enslavement created not only the not free, but the projection of the not me, right? So anti-Blackness is ingrained not only in this country's cultural identity, but in every institution, and that includes, of course, education. That history, it's been attempted to be buried and covered over, but now really those were seeds that have been blossoming, and the fruit of which nobody wants to eat or deal with. So I think, just like Rosa was saying, addressing anti-Black racism starts with acknowledging that, right? It's rejecting denial as a stance. And I've heard said before that the first revolution is an internal one. So I think that rejection of denial is the first step, and then we go from there. And that's a stance of unlearning a lot, and asking ourselves, what do I need to unlearn? What have I been believing without even realizing it? I saw this thing a long time ago, and it said, don't believe everything you think. I was like 18 when I saw it, and I was like, what does that mean? You know, why wouldn't you believe everything you think? How is that? But I've learned, you know, our perspectives are malleable. Entire paradigms are malleable. So in this conversation about race and technology and education, with regard to race, of course, it's addressing anti-Black racism, thinking and acknowledging dehumanization, rejecting human hierarchies. But I think in technology too, it's unlearning these notions that innovation is inherently tied to progress, or it's a determinant of improved educational outcomes. I think we've seen some of that. You know, there's increasingly more research coming out showing that there's nothing transformative about tools in and of themselves. And on the contrary, we're seeing more and more studies on how tools, digital technologies, perpetuate and even exacerbate inequity and injustice, right? Some of the stuff with Safiya Noble and Meredith Broussard, Imajulu and McGregor, some of their work shows that this hardware that we're using is built on exploitative labor. We see, I live here in the Bay Area, wealth inequality being perpetuated by the tech industry and displacement, gentrification. So there's all these ways in which, you know, whether it's at an individual level, you join those of us who have been Facebook objectors, but more broadly as educators, like how are we pushing back on digital designers? How are we as school leaders or teacher educators and teachers adopting tools on our own terms, right? And furthermore, like coming to the point where we're designing tools on our own terms, not the other way around. So that's some of the work that I do at Berkeley. I think the key is like, we're stronger than we think, more powerful than we know. And it's taken a moment like this to just release just a touch of our collective potential. That's how I've been thinking about it.
Okay, that's some great thinking right there. I mean, how are we pushing back? And then also thinking about Rosa, acknowledge, declare, and invest. And how are we unlearning some of the things that we currently know about this world, technology adoption, etc. Did I see someone? I think I saw Bettina ready to jump in.
It was me. Yeah. Can I just add on to what Sharice was saying? I'm Bettina Shea. I'm director and professor of teacher education at the University of Laverne. And I just wanted to say, just to build off what Charisse was saying, in teacher education spaces, like we see the impact of anti-Black racism when we look at the dearth of Black educators, right? And Black teacher educators, right? So we have to acknowledge, because we see the impact, right? Like there's a reason that there aren't Black educators and Black teacher educators more prominently in our field, right? The ones that are out there are doing amazing and excellent work, but we need to center their voices and perspectives, because when we look at the California teaching force, I'm based in California, you know, we look at what 2% of our teaching force is Black males, right? And we have to look at what is it that causes our system to perpetuate inequality such that representation of our teachers and our teacher educators doesn't reflect representation of our student body, right? Our diverse student body. And so we have to really ask ourselves, like, what are we doing to perpetuate these things, right? Like, how have we benefited from anti-Black racism? How do we perpetrate anti-Black racism? How do we confront anti-Black racism when we see it around us? Because, you know, I think one of the things that's been confronting for me as somebody who is aware of anti-Black racism in teacher education and education spaces generally is, so what am I doing to call it out in that moment, right? And how am I showing that support both individually and systemically, right? Because I think it's fighting it on both sides, right? When we think about investing, like how do we invest in dismantling systemic racism while also not like taking that as an out in terms of what we do individually and interpersonally, because it's a both and, right? And when we think about that in terms of digital equity, I mean, what we see in digital spaces is, as Charisse and Rosa have both said, like it's perpetuating the things that we're doing in non-digital spaces as well, right? So when we think about what is pushing out our Black teachers and our Black teacher educators, well, what's pushing them out in digital spaces too, right? How are we making things accessible and equitable as we think about online spaces, as we think about alternative formats of fieldwork, as we think about alternative ways that we build relationships and who's taking up spaces in our classes. So I think all of these things are things that we have to constantly think about through a lens of anti-Black racism, right? And addressing it.
I agree completely. And I'm also reminded of, as we think about, you know, equity and digital equity, it's hard to separate those two. And what we're talking about definitely has me thinking about the book written by Rafron Davis, The Missing Voices of EdTech, that I feel people need to pick it back up and read it again, because those missing voices are the voices that we should be listening to right now. For people who are trying to figure out how to do this work. I mean, there are so many voices that we ignored that we need to now listen to. So Valerie, please jump in before we move on to our next question.
Yes, absolutely. I wanted to piggyback on something that Bettina mentioned. So in the role that I serve as an assistant principal at a high school, this is one of the areas that I'm constantly having to revisit, bring up when we talk about data. Looking at a building that has about 128 educators, and out of those 128, 111 are Caucasian, but the school population is 36% African American. And so when I bring that up to my team, you know, are we looking at intentionally recruiting, you know, some African American males or females or whatever the case may be? You know, I hired my department chair as a special education African American female, and there was chatter amongst the group about, is she just gonna hire everybody Black? And I'm like, so I just added one more person, just one, and that's an issue. But when you guys added about 110, nobody had an issue with that. And so, you know, now's the time. It's like, well, what was the problem? She was qualified. She was the best candidate of anyone that was on the pool. So no, I didn't just hire her because she was Black. She just so happened to be Black. And that for me came beyond all the other things that she was able to bring to the table. And so when I think about the young men that are in our building, teenagers trying to find themselves, football players, athletes, and I look out into the sea of their coaches, and there's not even one African-American male coach. And I know that there's something that those boys that look like my sons need, that although these coaches care for them, can't give to them, because there's that cultural connection that just doesn't exist. And it doesn't happen. And so it's an important thing, as Bettina mentioned, that we are hiring. Why do they leave? Because sometimes those males, when they come into buildings, they are faced with issues and things that the other males don't have to. And so unfortunately, they're pushed out. Not that they left, they were pushed out. And then when they're pushed out, they are replaced, not by another African-American male, but by others. And so that is problematic. And so we certainly need to address it. And I know I'm one administrator on my team out of 12, but maybe more than just me, need to share that ideology in school buildings across America.
Thank you. Yes, Valerie, I agree. We need more people sharing those values. Rochelle, I think you were ready to jump in here.
Yeah, and not that listening to all of you and your perspectives and different roles, it really, that's the one thing for me. I mean, I'm a high school teacher. I teach Spanish and STEAM. I've been teaching for a long time, but my whole experience in education, and I didn't think about this until people were starting to put questions out there on Twitter, like, what age were you when you had your first teacher your first Black educator? And for me, over the past couple of days, I had a couple conversations with friends too. And I said, just for the longest time of my life, I didn't even know what the appropriate terminology was. Was it okay for me to say that I have a friend who is Black? I mean, because where I live, my schooling experience, it was predominantly white is what it was. And honestly, I don't think that I had my first teacher who was Black until law school. And that is a really long time to go through. And I think about the impact of that just on me. And now, fortunately, I've had friends who I'm really close with. And so I can listen to their experiences and it makes me more aware. Whereas I didn't have that opportunity to connect with educators to hear that firsthand in the school setting. And so as a teacher, as everything has been kind of coming up in conversations over the past week or longer now with this, I've really been trying to think, what do I need to do? Like, what should I say? And we're not in school, so it's different now to imagine what would it be like in my classroom, and putting myself in check. What have I been doing as a teacher for my students? And I have a lot of students who, I don't really know a lot about their families, but when I started teaching, my school that I teach in compared to the school I went to high school, we didn't have very many Black families that live there. And still, even to this day, I don't think there are that many. So understanding their backgrounds and experiences. So in this past week, I've really been tuning in. I guess what I would say for me is I've been trying to learn, educate myself, and then what can I do to advocate beyond that? So take all of that in. And so I've been processing a lot of books and podcasts and webinars and chats and really trying to connect, but also looking at myself. What have I done along the way that helped my students to build their own awareness, or to look at myself, did I treat anybody differently? Like, there's so many things that I'm calling into question about myself now as an educator and as a person, and it bothers me, and that's great. But now it's like, what do I do with that? Now that I know where I've come from, and now I know what I'm learning and what I'm seeing, how am I going to use that for good? And how am I going to use that in my classroom to help my students as well? And so that's kind of, it's been interesting trying to process it. And I've said, I don't know what to say, but then sometimes I have a lot to say, and it's just, I'm internalizing all of it and trying to learn as much as I can, and then come up with, where do I go from here?
I think what you definitely, you spoke to what Charisse was saying, and that we have to ask ourselves, what do we need to unlearn? And it sounds like you are in that space, and we appreciate you as a colleague for being willing to, be transparent and say that you're in a space of trying to figure some things out. I know that I've worked with you through the Parent Square Learning Network and seen the work there that you are doing in creating space and elevating voices. And so it's also about trusting that voice within, especially coming from a place of someone who has a heart that is willing to learn and unlearn. So Patricia, we're ready for you. Sorry, we're ready for question 2. We took that one like, what?
Yeah, that was great. I mean, it was so many different layers and so many different aspects. And we got some heavy hitters on this panel. I mean, some deep people on this panel, and it's amazing. Just hearing about like the whole process of unlearning, and when you think about a lot of times the things that I'm hearing as it relates to the lack of diversity in teachers, and we can't find Black male teachers, or we can't find female teachers or people of color, period. They're not there. And I think, I don't know if Valerie mentioned it or Bettina, I can't remember which one of you mentioned it, but being intentional and having specific recruitment efforts available. And I'll just say this, you always look at Black males are, we have the least amount of Black males as it relates to Black female teachers or, teachers of color, period. And I always attribute that to the salaries that teachers are paid. And as a male, as a head of the household, you have to be able to take care of your family. So I think if we ever get that part fixed, we might see an influx of more Black educators in the roles and in the fields. And then once they get there, the other part that we need to also consider is that inclusive part. Like, getting you in the door is one thing, but how do you get you to stay? And if I don't feel welcome, I don't feel part of your community, I don't feel part of your environment, and you don't make me feel like I am a member of this community as a whole, then I'm not going to stay. So we have to consider that. The recruitment is great, getting them in the door, but what type of supports do you have in place for those educators that you are bringing in, and making sure that they don't feel like they are the only, and they feel like they are, on a island by themselves. So I just wanted to say that part, but I love what you all said. So going on to question 2. So we talked about addressing things, calling it out. We talked about how we can now change, unlearn what we've been taught or what we perceived. So under that lens, when you are educating teacher leaders, educators, what are you currently doing to support those future teachers? So we can even talk about parents and students as well. So as they root out racism, depending on where they are in their journey, they might be going from being an ally to now they're more into the non-racist or non-racist or anti-racist, like they're on that different spectrum. So considering all of that, think about talk to us about how you are helping them root out racism and oppression. For example, are you guiding teachers or colleagues in their selection of anti-racist digital tools? Right now, they're everywhere. Every Twitter post, every Instagram, every Facebook, you see somebody with a list of books that you should read, a list of articles you should read. So kind of pointing out and figuring out which ones are of quality, because anybody can write a Medium post. But we all know that we need to address this in all these different spaces. So I don't know who wants to jump in first, but let's talk a little bit about some of the strategies, some of the things that you are doing. Rochelle, look, you're unmuted.
Yeah. I figured I should probably, since I went last time, I'll just jump in there. But yeah, a couple of things. I mean, a lot of the things that you were just talking about, just in my own mind, when you said about the social media posts and everything out there, is I have been gathering as much as I possibly can. Of course, looking at the source and making sure for reliability and all of that too, but just trying to gather as much as I can. I've been putting it into a Wakelet, and it's links to podcasts, it's books. Somebody had a post out there, they're going to do a book study, and there's so many for elementary teachers, I mean for school, for us to learn, for professional development. So trying to make sure that I know, because even though I teach high school, I also do webinars and training and that in my role in ISTE with Teacher Education Network. Of course, I want to make sure I have resources to share. So trying to take in as much of that as I can. Like even today, I went for a walk and I was listening to Sheldon Aiken's podcast this afternoon. And then I was reading a blog after that and ordered some more books. Making myself aware of what's out there is one thing, but then it's interesting in my role as a teacher, a couple of times my students in my classroom were working on different projects using some different digital tools. And I can remember, and it was a couple of my girl students who were athletes, and they were working on, I won't say the tool at the time, but they were really frustrated because they couldn't find enough of their characters in this product that were for girls playing soccer or for girls playing softball, for example. And they were really bothered by that. And then other students started to say, well, how come they don't have more that look like me or that represent my interests? And so that's probably, and that's been a couple of years now, that's where I started to notice more about the different tools that I was using in my classroom for students to create, but also the ones that I had been using just to gather ideas from. And there are some that I've used more recently, and I mean, even for like a long-term period, that have really been joining in the conversations and making their tools and their platforms more inclusive so that students, teachers, anybody, even parents at this point, can find what they need and to learn. And I think that one of the most powerful things too is for my students, even though I'm teaching Spanish, I mean, we do a lot of study learning. I've really extended it to do project-based learning. And I want them to understand more than just what it's like to live in their community. What is it like to go to school in some other place where Spanish is spoken, and to develop, I mean, empathy, and to know, like, not everybody lives in the same house. Not everybody dresses the same way, and all of those different ways that we can compare, but to help them process stereotypes too as part of our conversation. And for me, when I first started to do that, it was uncomfortable because I was partially afraid of, you know, what are the students going to say? And what if I don't say the right thing back to them? But then I realized if I don't ever have these conversations, what's going to happen whenever they're out of my classroom and they're confronted with something where they need to say something or they need to act up and advocate for somebody, I haven't helped to do my part to prepare them. And so tying in as much as I can just to keep myself learning. I think that's the biggest thing, is like we have to make sure that we're constantly learning and knowing what's out there and sorting through everything and staying connected, and not being afraid to ask questions which may be uncomfortable. I left a box to a friend the other day and I said, I'm sorry, this is probably going to be like a 10-minute message that I'm all over the place, but I feel comfortable asking you this. And I mean, it was so helpful to me to ask and to have that space. So that's a lot of information, but it's just being connected and sharing ideas and resources when we find them, so that it's not just our students and our colleagues that we're helping, it's more beyond our space.
And I just wanted to build off what Rochelle said in terms of representation and the importance of not only representation, because I think representation matters, but the forms of representation, like how we represent people of color, LGBTQIA folks, right? Like within our classrooms, within our spaces. You know, I know Erica had mentioned in the chat, you know, if we want young Black males to consider teaching, then they have to feel that they matter in their school experiences, because a lot of them have bad school experiences. And I think that's really important. So in my teacher education work, one of the things that I really try to do is have my teacher candidates, right, really think about not only their experiences, but like what might it be, like who was represented in their experiences, right? Like when did you have like teachers of color? Like who's represented in the media? How are they represented in the media, right? Who's represented in the literature you read, right? I'm a literacy person. And how are they represented in the literature that you read, right? So when we think about, you know, the tools, right? Because I think going back to Sharice's point, it's not about the tools themselves, but also about a critical lens when we think about how we're applying the tools, right? And when we look at all of the tools, like for me, it's really important that my teacher candidates have that lens of criticality, like, because once you see something, you can't unsee it, right? So once you see like, oh, every Black character that I've seen has been like put in this role where they're like a supporting character, or like it reinforces this stereotype, or like every Asian person is quiet in the book, or like I've never actually seen an Asian person in a book, in curriculum, in anything that I've read in my K-12, right? You actually start to begin seeing the world around you with that lens too. And I think that's really, really important, because our goal as teachers is not just to teach content, but to teach students to read context, right? And participate in the world in really important ways. And I think if we can do that in classrooms, then that helps to mediate their interactions with digital spaces outside of the classroom too. And when we think about digital equity, it's not just like the tools we give them, but also what they bring to the space and how they're interacting outside of the classroom space in digital spaces, right? And so I think it's so important as we're training up teachers, as we're working with teachers, to help them develop that critical lens so that they can then empower their students, right, to be more critical and not just mass consumers without actually thinking about what is this actually saying? Like, what's the subtext behind this? Not just like, what do I see in front of me? Because we can passively consume all sorts of stuff, and it really like impacts the way we see ourselves, impacts the way we see the world and other people. And so I think it's really important, like, not just that we focus on content and tools, but that we focus on context and lens.
I think I just wanted to add one little piece to that, Bettina. Fantastic. Teaching our parents, helping our parents be able to do the same, empowering them with that similar lens and skills to be able to do that with kids is really important. So that partnership where you're engaging parents in a different way is also part of that work. Sometimes we tend to do those things in isolation, in silos at school, and really to create this movement and change, we need to bring our parents along to be able to do that work. And that includes all parents, not just parents of Black and brown kids.
I wanted to add a piece as well to the supporting the new teachers and teachers that are existing in the building. So from the administrative lens, I have to be mindful of, or I have to see for the teachers sometimes the things that they don't see that impact our students. So when teachers are running to my office with a discipline referral because such and such came in with an attitude and won't put away their cell phone, I have to remind them, is this truly critical enough for you to write a referral? Because there are some teachers who will misinterpret me not processing that referral as me not supporting them. And I have to always remind my teachers, I'm going to support you when it is truly the right work. But stacking referrals against students, especially students that are, of color, it has a greater impact. Sometimes we can diffuse the situation. Sometimes the teacher has been the irritating factor. And I'm going to be upfront. They come into my office and I'm like, oh my gosh. And so I can only imagine what the kids are going through on a day-to-day basis, 5 days a week. And so I have to remind that teacher that, was there a different way that we could have done this? Could we have addressed it differently? And so making sure that they take a look at, was there something that I did? And sometimes I believe it's just the hidden bias sometimes, because they have it pegged in their mind. This is my 18-year-old ninth grader, catch what I said, 18-year-old ninth grader who doesn't want to be in school. So that teacher has already built up a wall. Well, they just come in here because, and so every little thing that child does is problematic. And so I think sometimes we have to help teachers, new teachers, veteran teachers, to be able to look at those things that sometimes stack against our students and be able to support them so they understand, no, you're not ignoring them, but we have to be able to address this differently because our ultimate goal is for that student to win. And we have to get out of our feelings sometimes as adults and be able to step aside so that we can make sure that child wins, but we got to do it together as a team.
I'm really appreciating the integrated like approaches to thinking about how we will support our students. Many of you have said things that I've been also thinking about. Rosa, you were mentioning like the partnerships, and I think that's something that we've like, it's been front and center as we've if we haven't already been thinking about it, right, as everybody's at home and we've had to imagine like what are we doing to really honor the brilliance of our families and how they are you know what they are doing at home with their students, you know, not assuming that learning is not happening at home. How are we making sure that we you know, center the great things that non-dominant youth are, you know, creating. And I think that's one of my goals as a researcher is to bridge the digital or bridge the pedagogical part of digital learning with like understanding like the digital has limitations and honoring the brilliance of our families. Families are creative, right? Understanding also that teacher learning is expansive. Our teachers are experienced. They all have practices and knowledge to contribute. So with that being the baseline, like we must work in partnership. I think that's what I wanted to say. And then Bettina, what you were saying, it reminded me too of like everything you were talking about is about critical digital literacies, right? How are we reading the word and the world? That's really how I frame what we do at with our teachers at Berkeley. Honoring the teachers' repertoires of practice and how they're able to come in and read the tools and the texts that they are using to design digitally mediated learning. And then the world includes their students, the social environments, and really critically like themselves in it. How are they reading, constructing, deconstructing with and within the digital tools for the purposes of liberation for their students? And I think one of the constructs we think about is training our teachers to be teacher leaders. And that is, you know, what that means is being willing to ask critical questions and to sure be early adopters on the tech adoption cycle, but for the purpose of critically engaging with that cycle of innovation, right? Being the first ones who'll say, sure, I'll try this tool out in my school, but I'm gonna have critical feedback about how it's used. I wanna try things in partnership with other teachers. I want to think about the positionality of this tool in like the whole ecosystem of what's happening in this environment. What's the reciprocity agreements that this tech company or this, you know, initiative is gonna offer to us? How might we use this to further the socio-political goals of our families here? You know, that kind of early adopter that is willing to honor and appreciate the diversity, linguistic diversity, cultural diversity of the school, you know, of the students, and to, you know, again, engage in dismantling the kind of anti-Blackness that exists in our schools.
Wow, that is excellent. I love how you said honoring the brilliance of our families and our teachers. And I think it just came down to what everybody was saying is just asking those tough questions, being reflective, being an advocate for your students in the ways that they need you in that moment, and being able to just have those conversations, and even looking at the digital world, the digital spaces, and making sure that you're holding those companies and those organizations accountable for what they're providing for your schools. Especially if we're spending money, we need to be able to have it be something that is beneficial for all of our students, not just some of our students. So great. All right, I'm passing it over to you, Nicole. Question number 3.
Yes, so question number 3, I just wanted to say one quick thing. I promise, Patricia, I'm not going to keep running my mouth. I'm going to be quick because we have about 20 minutes to go through our last 2 questions and we want to hear from our panel. My quick follow-up is that as we think about how we're evaluating tools, that we also remember, and I think someone may have mentioned this, but think about how our students might see themselves in the tools, because there are times where we select tools that have avatars that don't even represent the population of our students. So we need to also, you know, think critically about it on that level as well, you know, so put the student lens on while we advocate as educators on behalf of the families and students. So this is our next question. I say my because I really want to know what you guys think about this. Okay, we have a lot of new students and teachers entering teacher prep programs, but we have current teachers and even parents now who are feeling like they're embarking on new learning, unlearning in a very nuanced way. And so we want to hear from you. What's your view on the most important issues that we should be confronting right now as we have an opportunity to potentially reimagine education? Whew, the panel is quiet.
I'm going to jump in.
Okay.
Some of the biggest issues right now as we prepare for what the fall may bring. So today we got guidance from the California Department of Ed. We've received guidance from a number of organizations, and the major issue is, are we coming back to school? Are we physically having kids come in? And if we have kids and staff come in, then we have to, number one, think about safety. If they're not coming in, then we are not only thinking about, safety is important, of course, wherever you are, but do our students have the tools to have new learning, consistent learning, and do our teachers have the capacity, have they developed enough capacity to be able to deliver that new instruction if we go strictly virtual? So that piece is, we have a sense of urgency about it, because we still have students across the nation who don't have access to devices, who don't have access to Wi-Fi. And the bottom line is, if kids don't have that as a basic tool, then they won't be able to have access to new learning. And I know a lot of districts resorted to packets or a hybrid of, packets and distance learning via Zoom or other platforms. And it just created this even wider opportunity gap for many of our kids. And so it's the basics. It's like having a pencil. If we are not returning, how are we ready? Because we know we can do better. Teachers did an incredible job. We did as much as we could, as quickly as we could in that short amount of time. The reality is that a lot of kids didn't get new learning. There was a lot of, okay, let's review, let's look at this. But to have that instructor sharing new knowledge with kids was a challenge. So the basics for me are to ensure that our kids have the tools they need, whether they're at school or they're home, doing this new learning in a new way.
I would say maybe the delivery of instruction. So maybe instructional design, because as Rosa mentioned, you have those teachers that it may have been a comfort. They were comfortable doing it because they had been utilizing it already. They had been utilizing the tech throughout the school year, but then you have a lot of teachers who, they were panicking. I mean, just as simple as get on a Zoom call or Google Meets or just set up a Teams, and they were just like, I don't know what to do. I don't know what that is. And just refuse to do it. So I think instructional design, how do you build modules in an online format, if we are going back to school virtually, that can still be engaging, that still kind of moves instruction along as best as you can, and then thinking about building those relationships with those students through that online module. How do I still tap into those students' emotional needs, and they feel like it's still a safe space for them to connect, though we are digital? And then just thinking about ways in which teachers can think about learning in a cross-curricular way. So Be a teacher, not just a language arts teacher. Be a teacher, not just a social studies teacher, but bring that history into your language arts class, add the math, get kids excited. Because I think that's, you know, even in the face-to-face model, let's just even remove tech. The kids are bored out of their minds. You know, what the teachers are teaching them, I mean, these kids have YouTube channels. They are creating games in their homes, minus the teacher. And then they have to show up to school and just listen to this person. And they're like, really, lady, or really, man? So I think we have to really think about, as ourselves, building our teachers' capacity and stretching them where they feel comfortable enough to take a risk, and understanding that you don't have to know it all before you deliver it to your students. They will teach you and they will be glad to do it. And so just like we want our students to take risk, we have to build these adults to understand, you know, take a risk and just grow and stretch and allow students. We have to reimagine learning in a different way, and it's more than just now doing the interactive smart board, and or some teachers still doing the PowerPoint lectures. So I think reimagining teaching is really thinking about, who are these kids? I mean, these infants are coming out the womb swiping. So you have to think about those kind of babies. So so that's the reimagining that I'm thinking about. So if we are going to create something online, we sure better be intentional and thinking about how that's going to help kids get closer to their passion points and their purpose.
Yes. Oh, Bettina, I know you want to go too. I feel like a fire after what you said, Valerie. I just want to share, I'll share very briefly. What you're talking about is just so exciting about like a digital pedagogy. It is not just taking what you've been doing and like trying to transfer it online. That will kill you if you're trying to do 6 hours of just listening to a teacher talk online. That's what we saw, I mean, in higher ed, where it was just like, I'm trying to put my lecture online. Nobody want to listen to that all day. You have to think about, how does your pedagogy have to change, you know, where there's this participatory ethos where it's like, I want to be able to engage, I want to make stuff, like you said, making YouTube videos. This is where the repertoires of practice that youth have with technology give us the chance to switch the onus. Now that's, like you said, exactly, that's risky. How as teachers, we're going to be like, I'm the teacher, what are you doing? You know, well, this is the opportunity to think about re-articulating leadership, re-articulating, you know, this dynamic of who is the, how does learning happen? It's an ecology. It's not this hierarchical thing. And for young people, that works. You know, I'm the boss. I got my own YouTube channel. That's fine. But we have to surrender some control for that to happen. And when you talk about reimagining, this is the moment. This is the moment. We have, what I was going to say is like, we have felt it in our bodies in these last 3 months or so, what it's like to have new ways of life, to have new ways of new, like this whole idea of new learning. Boundaries have collapsed. We've seen how this stuff that they said could never happen, it is happening. You know, like schools, in this like very feminized profession, like as women, I can say, I'm at home now and my kids, my 2 little daughters are like, wow, I've never seen mommy work before. You know, I've never seen how they're coming alongside me and they're watching. They're like, that's what you do? They're seeing I do these Zoom cafe calls and they're seeing their aunties on here with me like, wow, look at Miss Asha. She's wearing work clothes. I thought she only wore workout clothes every day. You know, like this is giving a multi-dimensional kind of look at people and what these systems are about. I feel like my girls and all of our children are learning in very consequential ways. So I think it's a both and approach. Like as educators and as school leaders and as teacher educators, we have to be very careful to not pathologize what our kids are doing at home. This is not a matter of like, if they're not at school, they're not learning. If they're not at school, we need to get them hooked up. How can we, if we really want to reimagine, how can we get into, widen our apertures and imagine what we can learn from them in this moment? That's what I think. So it's a matter of, yes, let's keep them connected. Yes, let's use our expertise and you know, spread whatever knowledge we're capable of. But let's not discount what they have to offer too. Partnership. How are we going to build on that? And I'll just stop there. this is just, that's really got me going.
Well, so I have to build off Sharice. I know we're running out of time because this always happens, but like what really struck me about what Valerie and Sharice said is I think at the core of all of this is humanizing pedagogy, right? Like we need to humanize education. And when we think about how we can really reimagine education, like what's exciting to me is like what's coming up during this time is like the need for us to humanize, right? And I think there is this thing in our minds where we think that digital spaces like are inherently dehumanizing, but we really need to reimagine that, right? And I think that for a long time, education has been very like hierarchical and very and dehumanizing. And when we go back to anti-Blackness and, you know, racism in education, like part of that is dehumanizing practices, right? So when we think about like what needs to be confronted as we move forward, like we need to confront how we are drawing from the richness of the humanity of everybody in the room, right? Like we need to show ourselves grace, like as educators who may not be, right, well, all of us here like are pretty like on the forefront of digital technology, but there are a lot of educators who are struggling with that, right? And we need to honor that humanity, but also show them that doesn't mean you're weak, right? Like it doesn't mean that you, you know, are at this like profound disadvantage, because it actually puts you in this easier position to be a learner if you're willing to interrogate like how teaching and learning happens in whatever space you're in, right? Whether it's online, hybrid, in person, right? Because I think what this pushes us to do is to say, it doesn't have to be the way that it has been, right? It doesn't have to be this way. We can actually do something different because this has forced us to do something different, right? And once we can do one thing that is different, we can do many things that are different, right? And we can claim the power to reimagine in ways that actually humanize students, right? That actually like we can actually say like, how do our standards like lend to the humanity of students? How do our ISTE standards lend to the humanity of students? How are we using this in the service of like building our own humanity, acknowledging who we are as whole human beings, right? Like what Sharice was saying, it really struck me. Like I've been, for most of this pandemic, I've been in the same room with my family like all day, right? And so everybody sees what everybody's doing, right? And it has helped me to be a better educator because I'm a more human person and I am able to drop some of the compartmentalization that has been guiding my whole life, right? Like I can be a mom at this time and I can be a parent, or I mean, I can be a teacher educator at this time and I can be a student at this time. Well, that's not what's happening anymore. And I think that that compartmentalization is inherently dehumanizing. Like we need to bring our whole selves to our spaces. We need to bring in partnerships with our families, as Rosa was saying earlier. Like this is our chance to actually make education a human endeavor, which is what it always should have been in the first place.
Okay, so I know running on time, but I am still laughing about Val's swipe thing. I think I've been laughing for 5 minutes on that, and then Sharice with the workout clothes. But just a couple of things as I'm thinking back to, I was the teacher at the beginning, and I know a lot about technology, but it didn't matter with what amount of tech we were using, what our level of comfort is with, and all of this started because we were all in the same place. Like, where do we go from here? And I was the teacher who thought, okay, how do I take 42 minutes of what I was doing in my classroom and put it all into the virtual space where not all of my students will be able to connect with me? And that didn't go very well, obviously. And so it gave me a chance to kind of rethink everything. And so what I've really focused on over the past however long, and I too, Bettina, I've been in my house for like 3 months at this point. I'm convinced there's a world out there, but I've really taken it as an opportunity to learn more about my students and be mindful of their circumstances, I think is what it comes down to. And using things like a check-in or a form and having conversations with them during this time and finding out, yeah, they can't do the work because they have one device in their home, their parents aren't there, or their parents and all of their siblings are there and they don't have the space, and they're an essential worker because they're old enough and so they're going to work, and now they have all their classes online. And I wasn't seeing that. I was just seeing, I need to keep teaching them Spanish through the end of the year, and I have to meet, this is where I want them to be at the end of the year. And once I peeled that back and realized they didn't all have access, they didn't all have the time, and they had all of these other things going on, and was, like I said, more mindful of their circumstances and worked with them, I got rid of focusing so much on this is what I need to cover, and how are you? What can I do to support you first? And then how can I build upon that in some learning experience to get us through? And I focus more on, we need to worry about them now, because you can't make up for that time. So when time passes, if they needed you and you're like, oh, I'm sorry, you needed me 4 months ago, I was more worried about, did you do the assignment? You can't make up for that. And so I really tried to be mindful of the accessibility, what their needs were, and connecting with families. And then now moving forward, because we know better, we can do better the second time around. What are all of the gaps that I noticed in myself or just from conversations? And how can I prepare for that if we find out, you know what, we're not going back to our classroom tomorrow, we're virtual for part of the year or the whole year. What can I do better? Because now I have this experience, and now I know for my students and their parents what I need to do to prepare for them first and foremost before I decide this is the lesson for Spanish or for STEAM for the day.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rochelle.
My God, I'm like listening to all of the things that you all have said, and it really just resonated with me, because a lot of times we forget about the human part of teaching. Now, it's really interesting when we are face to face and we have our kids in front of them. It's natural for us to, like, especially in the elementary setting where we're just huggers, and for the most part, a lot of teachers are very much touchy-feely with their students, and they can see them and all that. So that, as much as it hurt our students to be outside of our classrooms and be home, I think it affected our teachers as well, just not having that connection with our students. And so when you all talked about, you have a few students that you may or may not be able to connect with, and just thinking about all of our families are experiencing things in different ways. And so we might have a disconnect with being physically on a computer virtually, but we may be doing things that are also a part of that learning process. I know for me as a parent, I'm trying to balance it all too. So just thinking about how just because they didn't log into that Google Classroom for today does not mean that learning isn't happening and taking place. And I think we're also, as much as this is a crazy, crazy time, I also believe that this is a blessing in disguise, because it really gives us an opportunity to rethink how we are teaching, how our classrooms look, what school looks like, all of those things I think that we've taken for granted. I think we actually have a perfect opportunity to make some changes and differences. So that being said, we're going to wrap up our with our final question. And I just want to ask our panelists, in light of our conversation, what final words of advice do you have for our education leaders and teacher educators regarding digital equity, anti-racism, bringing the humanity back into pedagogy, all of those things? And I just want to tell you that we only have about, I think we're over our time now, but we have 0 time. So if you could just make a quick final word, whoever wants to jump in, feel free.
One sentence. My advice as a Black woman, a mother and all that, it would be very useful to spend our energy unlearning what we need to unlearn, using our skill sets and our gifts, and do not get out there kneeling, wearing kente cloth or any other African garb and have your picture taken.
Yeah. I can go next. Mine is short too. That it's a movement, not a moment. And so do the work, right? We got to do the work.
I'll jump in. Don't stop. As Bettina said, it's a movement. So continue, and let's see this through.
I'll go. I was waiting to see if Valerie was going to go. I mean, the best advice I can have is just keep on learning. Look at yourself, your experiences, continue to find ways to educate yourself, connect. And like they all said, like you said, Bettina, it's not just a moment, it is a movement.
I guess I would say definitely continue to, push the envelope, especially when you know it's for the right cause. And you know, I know that's fearful at times because, you know, our jobs are our livelihood, but, you know, do what's in the best interest of the students, but also in the chat, as we saw, take care of your teachers and your people. Our human resources are our #1 resource in education. And so we have to do the work, we have to do the right work, and just continue to form groups like this. Stay connected, learn, grow, be willing to listen, be flexible. And as Sharice mentioned, I think the #1 thing for me to take away is just unlearn some things and be willing to grow.
And everybody, and I just wanted to say that, you know, this is a marathon, not a sprint. So don't feel like, I feel like a lot of times people are jumping and running and wanting to learn and we got to do this, we got to do that. Listen, you have to unlearn first, as Sharice told us at the very beginning, and then you have to work on yourself. So it's going to take some time to get to where you need to be. So don't feel like you have to, I mean, right now, Black Lives Matter, all those things are trending. So keeping that in mind, just making sure that we are continuing the work, and it's just not for this moment. Like someone mentioned, this is a movement, it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. And just know that we do not have all the answers. Mistakes will be made, but it's important that we are reflective and we think about what we're doing and saying as we move forward, especially as it relates to our children. So thank you everyone tonight for being on our panel. We had a dynamic panel tonight, dynamic women on this.
Yes.
So excited. Yes. Nicole?
Yeah, I was just going to say thank you guys too. One thing I would say, don't forget to recenter joy in this moment. Don't forget to embrace the relationships that you currently have with family, students, colleagues. Continue to build those relationships because they can't be built overnight when we have to reimagine education the next time. So dedicate some time to building those relationships and embrace the new form of integrating work in your home life. I think that's another great thing to embrace. Okay.
The panelists did, we needed to spend more time hearing from our panelists in this dynamic conversation that we had tonight. I'm so thankful that it's recorded so we can go back and we can listen and we can pause and we can like soak it all in again. So thank you so much, panelists. And we might need to do a part 2 at some point because it was a lot that we have to unpack still with this conversation. So thank you all so much. Everyone have a wonderful night and we will see you again next week.